Thank you to everyone who is able to join us today. We honestly are very pleased to see this level of interest in the climate conversation and really look forward to an enlightening discussion with Mr. Kennedy. My name is Rock Aboujaoude Jr. Along with Dr. Capece, Dr. John Capece, Nargiza Abdulhidova, and Michail Fidler, I serve as a director of Campus Climate Corps and the host for this meeting today. Campus Climate Corps is a program of two educational nonprofit organizations, the first of which is Intelligentsia International, which is a student exchange organization spinoff from the National Association of Graduate Professional Students. And the second one is Alpha Epsilon Lambda, the National Honor Society of Graduate and Professional School Students. Campus Climate Corps has participated in each of the United Nations climate conferences since Paris in 2015, where we deliver workshops and host exhibits on student engagement in the climate crisis. Today, we are very pleased to host a distinguished expert and activist on the issue of climate change, Mr. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We were not aware of this when we asked Mr. Kennedy to join us for the climate conversation, but he had actually just released a new book called Climate in Crisis. I received a copy of the book just a couple days ago and have only gone through the introductory chapters that talk about the recent political events and the various student groups engaged in the climate issue. And I really look forward to reading the rest of the book very soon. As a matter of introduction for Mr. Kennedy, he is the son of former U.S. Senator from New York and U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and nephew of former President John F. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy is an attorney, environmental activist, and author. He is the co-founder of Waterkeeper Alliance, an educational protection organization focused on the preservation and conservation of water resources. In addition to writing on environmental issues for numerous publications, Mr. Kennedy serves as senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council. Mr. Kennedy will make some brief opening remarks, and then I will manage the Q&A session. Mr. Kennedy, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Happy to be here with John. This is a kiss of me. Waterkeeper is one of 352 waterkeepers around the country, and I'll just say a word about the waterkeepers because my experience in the waterkeeper movement really colors my approach to climate change. And the waterkeepers was started by a blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen on the Hudson River back in the 1960s, and they got together in an American Legion Hall. We have on the Hudson one of the oldest commercial fisheries in North America. It's 350 years old. Many of the people I have represented for 40 years come from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times. It's a traditional gear fishery, and in 1964, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton Harmon rail yard, and the oil went up the river on the tides. It blackened the beaches. It made the shad taste of diesel, so they couldn't be sold at the Fulton Fish Market in New York City. And all the people in Crotonville came together in a American Legion Hall. They were almost all former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II, from Korea. Some of them were fresh back from Vietnam. These weren't radicals, they weren't militants, they were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. But that night they started talking about violence because they saw something that they thought they owned, which was the abundance of these fisheries that their parents had exploited for generations, and the purity of the Hudson's waters, which the Constitution of New York State said belonged to the people of the state. And these things were being robbed from them by large corporate entities over whom they had no control. And they went to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution, the Corps of Engineers, the Conservation Department, and the Coast Guard. And they were given the bum's rush. They were told by the Corps Colonel in Manhattan, whose job it was to shut down the Penn Central Pipe, these are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, he said, we can't treat them that way. In other words, we can't force them to comply with the law. And by this evening in March of 1966, virtually everybody in Crotonville had come to the conclusion that government was in cahoots with the polluters. The only way that they were going to reclaim the river for themselves is if they confronted the polluters directly. And somebody suggested they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central Pipe and burn up the pipe. Somebody else said they should roll a mattress up, jam it up the pipe, and flood the rail yard with its own waste. Somebody else suggests they float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant, which at that time was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. And then a guy stood up whose name was Robert Boyle, who was another Marine. He was a combat veteran from Korea. And he happened to be the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated magazine. And while he was working on an article on fishing, on angling in the Hudson for Sports Illustrated, he had come across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. And that statute said that it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught, but also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And the law had never been enforced in 80 years. And they resolved that night that they were going to start a group that was then called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association. It later became Riverkeeper. They were going to go out, track down, and prosecute every polluter on the Hudson. 18 months later, they shut down the Penn Central Pipe. And they got to keep $2,000 in bounty. They used that money to go after Ciba Geigy, Tuck Tape, Standard Brand, American Cyanamid. They collected the biggest penalty in United States history in 1973 against Anaconda Wire and Cable, $200,000. It was the biggest against any polluter ever. They used that money to build a boat. They hired me using bounty money in '84. They hired a full-time riverkeeper, a former commercial fisherman named John Cronin in '83, and we started suing polluters on the Hudson. And after I've brought, at this point, over 500 successful lawsuits against Hudson River polluters, and the river today is an international model for ecosystem protection. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator. The miraculous resurrection of the Hudson has inspired the creation of water keepers now all over the world. We're the biggest water protection group in the world. We're very proud of John's program in Florida, but it's one of several in Florida. And each of these people, like John, has committed their lives to protect a specific stretch of water. The reason I told this kind of lengthy story is that the lens through which I see global warming has always been through the kind of things that, my experience, the background of that experience that I learned with Waterkeeper. And a couple of the kind of broad themes that unite all the keepers are, number one, that we're not protecting the waterways for the sake of the fishes and the birds so much. We're protecting them for our own sake because we recognize that nature is the infrastructure of our communities. And if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a civilization, as a nation, which is to create communities for our children and provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as the communities that our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, what with those assets that we call the commons, the commonwealth, the public trust, it cannot be reduced to private property ownership, but by their nature are the possession of the entire community, the landscapes, the rivers, the beaches, the waterways that connect us to our past, to our history, that provide context to our communities, that are the source ultimately of our values, our virtues, our character as a people. Another thing I learned is that the waterways belong to the public. The air belongs to the public. The commons belongs to the public. This is ancient law. It goes back to Roman times. It's in the Code of Justinian. It's in the Magna Carta. There is no right to pollute. There never has been. There's always been punishments for it. There was a Clean Air Act in the 16th century in England that made it a capital crime to burn coal in London stoves, and people are executed for it. You have a right to use your property any way that you see fit. You have no right to use your property in a way that will diminish or injure the use of your neighbor's property. And pollution does that. So pollution is always illegal, and it always has been. Another, I think, broad theme that I learned from Waterkeeper is this idea that we hear so much of, if you look at Fox News or whatever, where the big polluters and their indentured servants in the political process and the Koch brothers and all these guys are always saying, we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. That is a false choice. And this is what I learned from Waterkeeper, because the people I went to work with were hardcore capitalists. They were people who were earning a living. To them, the waterway was their workplace. It was their recreational values. It was their property values. It was the foundation of their whole economic system. And they were put out of business, not because their economic model failed, but because somebody, the General Electric Company namely, had ended up corrupting and distorting the free market, destroying the free market by using political clout in Albany to dump its pollution illegally into the water. And the only reason that those fishermen went out of work was because somebody had corrupted the political process and therefore destroyed the market and the integrity of the market. And so, I came out of that system, and you hear these people on TV saying we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand, environmental protection on the other, is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure the economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what Fox News and the Koch brothers and President Trump want us to do, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy. And we can make a few people billionaires by impoverishing the rest of us. But our children are going to pay for our joyride. And they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes, poor health, huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time and that they will never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. Now, the big issue, I think, for all of us on this phone call, but if you read any paper in the United States, secondary to COVID, is energy. And it's always on the front page, whether it's, Fukushima, or whether it's an oil spill, or whether it's a superstorm or whatever. The way that we use energy is, we need energy. We need it to generate food. We need it to generate prosperity. We need it to generate jobs. The question is, can we do it in a way that is sustainable and that does not destroy other values? And, my answer to that is absolutely yes. About 6 years ago, I think it was in, maybe it was longer now, in like 2012, Sir David Putnam gave this really beautiful speech before Parliament. When Parliament was debating a cap and trade system to put a price on carbon. And I was very instrumental in what none of you guys remember, but it was called the Waxman-Markey bill that we passed in 2008, and then Bush vetoed it. But the Waxman-Markey bill was a cap and trade bill. And it was a system that was dreamed up by conservative Republicans when they thought it had no chance of passing. And what it did is it was really an elegant bill that applied market discipline to the discharge of carbon into the environment, so that, carbon is a waste product. You're not just allowed to dump it into the commons. And what this did is it recognized that we all can't just stop doing that. But what we should do is we should pay a price for it, so that we can rationalize a market to do what a market is supposed to do, which is to reward good behavior, which is efficiency, and punish bad behavior, which is inefficiency and waste. That's what the cap and trade bill did. And in our country, it was, it passed Congress, and then, it was killed by the oil lobby in the White House. And but 2 years later, they debated the same kind of bill, but a much tougher one in England, which they ultimately passed. And in England, people, since 1997 in this country, the oil industry has spent about $500 million trying to convince people that global warming is a hoax. Advertising works, so there's a large percentage of Americans that actually believe that, but in England, they didn't have that phenomena. So in England, everybody tends to believe in global warming, and they recognize it as a grim urgency that government needs to take a firm hand in addressing. And they all agreed, we need this cap and trade system. We need to eliminate our dependence on carbon. We need to decarbonize the society. And the question is, how do you do it and how fast? And there are people who said, you can't do it precipitously because it will cause these terrible dislocations in the marketplace. And that's going to cause more harm than good. And then, what we need to do is we need to do it incrementally. We need to do it slowly. And Lord David Putnam, who is one of the great, philosophical geniuses of Europe, he's a filmmaker. He made a wonderful film called Chariots of Fire. But he's also a member of Parliament. And he made this, he stood up and he gave a speech, and he reminded Parliament that 200 years before, the same body had debated the abolition of slavery. And at that time, everybody in England wanted to get rid of slavery. It was a moral abortion to the people of England. It compromised all of their pretensions of being kind of, this moral, the justification for their empire, which was they had this moral authority. And so people understood that it was inconsistent with all that, and they needed to get rid of it. The problem was, at that point, slavery represented 25% of the GNP of Great Britain. And it was the principal source of energy for the entire British Empire. Free human labor after wind, which was, which powered their sailing fleet. And so that people again argued, we can't do this suddenly. And they spent a year debating it. But after the end of that year, Great Britain made the moral choice and they abolished slavery outright, despite all of these predictions of economic calamity. And instead of collapsing, the British economy exploded as thousands of entrepreneurs rushed into that space to create new forms of energy that didn't rely on human labor, that were mainly mechanical, in an era that we now know as the Industrial Revolution, which was the greatest era of wealth creation in the history of mankind. And the abolition of the slave trade exposed all of these hidden inefficiencies that were associated with free human bondage. And today, we don't need to abolish our dependence on carbon to understand that it is the principal drag on American and global capitalism. We are spending today, according to the International Monetary Fund, globally, we spend $5.2 $2 trillion in subsidies to the carbon industry. In our country, it's about $1.3 trillion in subsidies to the carbon industry. It's double what we spend on the military. It's about 20 times what we spend on education. And we, what, in my view, and I differ with people who believe in, who are advocating the Green New Deal. I definitely sympathize with their enthusiasm and their commitment to it. But I really believe that, that the answer is easier than that, and that the better way to do this is to rationalize marketplaces. And the way that you do that is you eliminate subsidies. And the nation, and in order to decarbonize, you eliminate subsidies and illegalize them. And the nations that have done that successfully have encountered extraordinary prosperity. Sweden decarbonized, slapped $195 a ton tax on carbon, and within 2 years, its economy grew by 49%. Iceland, which was the poorest country in Europe, decarbonized. Iceland was largely dependent on foreign coal, which had to be delivered there from England and Germany and from the United States. And they completely decarbonized, and there was tremendous resistance against it, but they have these tremendous geothermal resources there, and they ended up switching completely to geothermal, and they developed a bauxite industry. Aluminum has to be smelted from bauxite, and it's very, very energy dependent. And they began shipping in the bauxite and smelting it to aluminum using their geothermal, and they went from the poorest country in Europe to the highest GDP in Europe per capita. And there are many other nations and places where you can talk about, the impacts of decarbonization, but we have in our country probably the best opportunity. Maybe Chile has an even better one, but our country, because Chile has these not only really good hydro, but it has, which I don't advocate, by the way, but it has really, really good solar in the Atacama Desert. A couple things you need for solar. You need 365 days of sunlight. But you also need a high altitude. And by the way, I want to say this, that about 15 years ago, I've been spending my whole life doing litigation and all of the other tools, what Martin Luther King called the tools of advocacy, agitation, legislation, litigation, education. And about 15 years ago, I started getting heavier and heavier into innovation. And I ended up joining the biggest green tech venture capital firm in the world, Vantage Point. We were the first investor and the biggest investor in Tesla. We built the biggest solar thermal plant in North America at Ivanpah. I also then went on the board of Starwood, and we built the biggest PV solar plant. But I was deeply involved in battery technology, energy transmission technology. I built one of my companies, built the transmission lines into New York City. So I'm not just speaking as an advocate, but as somebody who's in the business. And I see the opportunities in the business now. And I can tell you this, here's what the math is. It costs today in this country, if you look at the most recent Colorado bids, which are kind of the benchmark, about $1 billion a gigawatt, maybe $1.2 billion a gigawatt to build a solar plant. We have in our country, the Scientific American did a study that if we put solar on an area 75 miles by 75 miles in the desert Southwest, we could power the entire North American energy grid. You wouldn't do that because, the cloud passed over Arizona, you'd black out the country. But it's just an emblem of how much of the opportunity that we have here. We have the best wind of any country in the world, other than, Antarctica, which is not a country, but we have enough wind. That same study showed we have enough wind in just Texas, harnessable wind in Texas, Montana, and Wyoming to power the entire North American energy grid. And the great thing about wind and solar is that they're complementary to each other, because the wind in our country tends to blow at night, and the sun, of course, everybody knows this, it shines during the daytime. And so if you have the capacity, the transmission capacity to balance a grid, which is one of the things we need to now invest in, you would be able to do that fairly easily, using all, many different kinds of technology. But what was I going to say? I was saying something before I got distracted. Anyway, we have the great solar energy in our country. We have great wind energy. One of the problems that we have is that we have 3 separate grid systems in our country. So we have an eastern grid, we have a western grid, and we have a Texas grid. And they're not connected, and we don't have good transmission. We have DC transmission. Well, we have transmission that cannot do long haul transmission of energy. So if you're a farmer in North Carolina, in North Dakota, which is one of the windiest states, if you can put a wind farm, if you can put a turbine on on your cornfield, the cornfield is worth about $800 an acre without a wind farm. It's worth about 3,200 acres with a wind farm. So every farmer in North Dakota wants to put wind farms on. The problem is you cannot get your wind from North Dakota to the markets in Cleveland, Cincinnati, New Orleans, and New York, because the grids, one, are not united, and number 2, we don't have the capacity for long-term transmission of energy. And those are 2 of the things that we need to do. That investment is a very small investment. That's the kind of investment the government needs to make. We built a highway system in the 1980s, and it created, the American economy, and it created the American middle class. I can tell you other times that we've done this. In 1997, in 1989, we built an ARPANET grid in our country, and we built a market for the internet, and people thought it was crazy. And the following year, in 1980, the CEO of IBM said that his company was getting out of the personal computer business because it was a dead-end industry. This is 1990. Well, within a few years, everybody had personal computers. And it's because we built the market. And what happened to the cost of bits and bytes? It went to 0. So, when I grew up, I was in China one time, and I was talking to these Chinese friends about this. When the internet first, when you started first being able to get Safari on your telephone, and I was saying, what if you wanted to, and they didn't have it over there at the time. I said, what if you wanted to know what Mao Zedong's favorite lunchtime meal was? Well, when I was a kid, prior to '89, you'd have to send somebody down to the Library of Congress in Washington, and they'd spend 2 weeks in the stacks, and they'd try to find it. And it would cost a lot of money. and you may not find it at all. But now for free, you can punch it into your phone and you can have it in seconds. So that's what happens to bits and bytes when you build the market. Now, in 1997, we passed the Telecommunications Act in this country, and Bill Clinton said to all the baby bells, you got to unite your lines, you got to make one international unified market. And the lowest cost provider is going to win. You cannot exclude people. And, and the world we live in today is like, not only did it generate all these gadgets, which are now part of our lives, but also when I first started teaching at Pace University Law School, it cost to make a long distance phone call to London, it cost $75. There was only one phone on campus that was capable of making an international call. And it was in a professor named William Wies's office, who was taught, some kind of foreign law. And we had to go ask Mr. Sign Up and ask Mr. Wies if we could use his line because it was so hideously expensive. And it's hard for my kids to imagine that today. They think every phone will connect them to everybody in the world, but that's what happened. The cost of phone calls, because we created a market, went to zero. And that's what we need to do now with energy. We need to create a national grid system that turns every American home into a power plant, every American into an entrepreneur. I have a home in Mount Kisco, New York, that has state-of-the-art solar panels on the roof, and it has a geothermal system. And that home, 365 days a year, is producing more energy than it uses. It's a power plant. Why can't I sell that power plant back onto the grid like a normal power plant can? The state of New York, there's no state that will let me sell all of it back for the same prices that they're paying to a power plant. And that's because we don't have free market capitalism. We have a market that is governed by rules that were written by the incumbents, by the oil industry, the coal industry, and the nuke industry, to reward the dirtiest, filthiest, most poisonous, most toxic, most warmongering fuels from hell, rather than the cheap, clean, green, wholesome, and patriotic fuels from heaven. And what we need is a marketplace that will rationalize, will do what a market is supposed to do, which is to reward good behavior, punish bad behavior. And that marketplace will democratize our country, because the political system of a country tends to reflect its economic organization. And, the oil industry and the coal industry, as they can control those resources, we rely on them for energy. And you look at any country that has big deposits of coal or oil, and they're tyrannies. There are places like Saudi Arabia where women can't drive a car without being locked in jail, and they cut people's heads off every Wednesday in the parking lot behind the Riyadh mosque. And they cut up their political enemies with bone saws. And you look at any of the, it's called the resource curse. You got a lot of oil and coal. You have almost, with only one exception, which is Norway, which is this really, brilliant thing with its resources. But all the other ones have to, and look at the states, most corrupt states in our country: Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi. They're the ones with big oil deposits. And so, and they're the least democratic. And what, the worst nightmare for those guys is if we democratize our energy system so that every American, is now able to harvest the energy on their roof and sell it when they're away, or sell it on vacation, or sell it when they're smart about generating a lot of it. So I'll close with one. I could talk for the rest of the day, but I won't do that to you. I'll give you a chance to ask some questions, or to open up conversations. But what I would say is, I have said from the beginning of my kind of tenure as an environmental advocate, People say to me, what's the best environmental law that we could pass? I always say the same thing. It's true free market capitalism. We don't have that now. We have something called corporate crony capitalism. In a true free market promotes efficiency. And efficiency means the elimination of waste. Pollution is waste. A true free market would force us to properly value our natural resources. And it's the undervaluation of those resources that causes us to use them wastefully. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. What polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else. And they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. That's what all pollution is. And when General Electric, came into the Hudson Valley, they're making capacitors in a plant in upstate New York, and they were dumping their PCB waste into the Hudson. And they put out a business. When I started working on the Hudson, there were 2,000 commercial fishermen who've been there for 350 years. Now there's 2. And all of those jobs were lost because GE dumped its PCBs in the Hudson and then refused to clean them up. And then when we tried to force them, they left New York State. And they left behind a cleanup bill that nobody can afford. So they made themselves rich by making the rest of us poor. And by deficit spending, by shifting the cost of their CEO and shareholder prosperity onto the backs of the public and of future generations. And that's what all pollution is. And what all of the environmental laws we passed after Earth Day 1970, 20 million of us came together on Earth Day 1970 and scared the hell out of the Republicans and the Democrats. And we passed in the next 10 years, 28 major environmental laws. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Endangered Species Act, RCRA, CERCLA, et cetera. We created EPA. We forced Republican President Nixon, kicking and screaming, to create it. And all of those laws that we created were designed to restore free market capitalism by forcing actors in the marketplace to pay the true cost of bringing their product to market. And what we do as riverkeepers is we see ourselves not just as an environmentalist, but as free marketeers. We go out into the marketplace, we catch the cheaters, the polluters, and we say to them, we're going to force you to internalize your costs the same way that you internalize your profits. Because as long as somebody is cheating the marketplace, it distorts the entire marketplace, and none of us gets the advantages of the efficiency, the prosperity, and the democracy that free market capitalism otherwise promises our country. There's a big difference that Americans have to understand between free market capitalism, which makes a nation and a society more efficient, more prosperous, and more democratic, and the kind of corporate crony capitalism, which is as antithetical to prosperity, democracy, and efficiency in America as it is, in Nigeria. So, John, I will shut up. I can see you getting antsy.
One of the observations to your comments that I have, and I'm not sure it warrants an answer, but you're sort of describing a situation where our economic system is both our greatest asset and our greatest obstacle in addressing this climate change issue. And you've talked about it from sort of the supply perspective, achieving efficiencies and improvements in our supply system. But we also have the flip side, which is the demand. People can produce greener, but if the demand is still for ever increasing consumer goods, that's still going to create a burden on the system. We have to get people, at least in the short term, to limit their
but this
consumption
is not
desire.
talking about deals with both supply and demand, because
Right.
what you're saying is you're putting a cost. I mean, listen, free market capitalism is the greatest economic engine ever devised by humanity. But it has to be harnessed to a social purpose.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it's going to pull us down, inexorably down the path of environmental apocalypse and plutocracy. That's where it will take us if left on its own. Oh, our job is to make up rules that make it so that it's beneficial for people, that people can get rich by doing good things, right? And that, and therefore they do it. I have a friend, Jim Rogers, who you may not know, but he used to run Duke Energy. And he was deeply concerned because he had the biggest coal fleet in the country. And he had to operate that coal fleet because it was the cheapest energy he had, because all the coal plants were amortized. The coal he was getting was subsidized. So he was generating energy for 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And he couldn't just shut them down because they were morally wrong, because the shareholders would sue him. So he went to Congress and he said, please write a law that says I have to internalize the cost of my pollution. Allow me to do the right thing. And the Koch brothers went and blocked him. And, so now we left a guy who has to get up every morning and make a decision, a very smart, moral man who has to make a decision. Am I going to get up today and am I going to serve the American public, or am I going to serve my shareholders? Because they're two competing antithetical interests. And what we want to do is create rules that make it so the only way you can get rich is by doing good things for society. And that corporations are an instrument of the state. Every corporation says in its charter, you are here to benefit the public interest. And if you do otherwise, you're subject to the death penalty. So this isn't new law, and it's nothing anybody could challenge. You just have to say, look, we're only going to allow you to make energy in this state if you fully internalize all the costs of that energy. And you force them to pay for the mercury they're dumping into the water, force them to pay for the $350 million in healthcare bills from ozone and particulates from coal burning power plants, force them to pay for the acid rain that sterilized every lake in the high peaks of the Adirondacks from Georgia to northern Quebec, force them to pay for the cost of global warming and all the toxics and all, Morgantown and all the poison water supplies. Coal now is going to cost not 2 cents a kilowatt hour, $2.50 a kilowatt hour, and nobody will ever go near it again. So, we end up that way using the cheapest sources of energy, which are going to be the cleanest ones.
Well, why don't we start moving into some of the student-oriented questions, and we'll start with Rock, since he's
Sure.
organized this event with us.
Yeah, Mr. Kennedy, once again, thank you very much for coming to today's event. And I do have a question that I think is intertwined with what you've been talking about today very, very closely. You, in your book, you write about the potential for regenerative agriculture to address the climate crisis. I'm currently applying to graduate school at the University of Florida to study carbon farming in particular, but I find that very few professors actually specialize in carbon farming or any other type of climate mitigation area, and only a handful of universities across our entire country really offer tailored degrees for these professions. So my question to you is this: how can we quickly get all of these universities to start offering these programs so that we can better prepare students like me for these type of climate careers?
I do not have the answer to that question, and I really don't know much about carbon farming. About a year and a half ago, some friends of mine, Woody Harrelson and a guy called Rylan, brought a movie over to my house and showed me that the first cut of that movie, Kiss the Ground. And that was the first kind of comprehension that I had about the potential for regenerative agriculture to actually restore very, very quickly, restore the atmosphere, an atmospheric balance of carbon. And it was a revelation for me. And I have to say, of all of the films, the many documentaries I've watched, that one gave me more hope than anything that I've ever seen, because it made me feel like, okay, we don't have to solve all of these other problems in India and China. All we got to do is fix the ground, fix the way that we do agriculture. But you know, it's not that I don't know something about agriculture, because I've spent a lot of my life litigating against factory farming. Against hogs. I've probably sued more hog farms and chicken farms than any attorney in the world. And so I know a lot about the worst kinds of practices of agriculture, but I was completely in the dark about the ability of just by changing basic agricultural practices and doing it. I mean, that film makes this incredible point. The film just came out now, so everybody can see it. It's called Kiss the Ground. But it also, one of the great parts of it, the guy who's kind of the star of it is this kind of right-wing Trump, skeptic, and he doesn't believe anything the environmentalists say. And by the end of the film, he's like, wow, I'm making 10 times as much per acre as I was making before I switched to this kind of agriculture, and I'm a convert. It's a really beautiful film, and it's really transformative, and I would recommend people watch it. But the answer to your question is a really good one, but I am not, all of the agricultural universities are, to me, they seem like kind of a hostile ground, because they seem so much they're like medical schools, which are owned by the pharmaceutical companies, and the agricultural universities all seem to be, kind of run by Monsanto, who I just did this big lawsuit against, a $12 billion settlement, and Tyson's Foods and Purdue and Cargill, and they seem to be really compromised by them. So I do not even know where to begin with them. That would be a whole new career for me to try to get into that mess.
Well, what's interesting, the nexus between the water issues and the climate issues is really this carbon farming, because every time you sequester, a unit of carbon, you also sequester nitrogen and phosphorus, which are the big drivers for our water quality problems. But let's Rock, you can move on to the questions from the students. Rock, ask, unmute.
Yeah, there we go.
So we have Simone. Simone, would you like to ask a question?
Yes.
And introduce yourself, please.
Of course. Hi, Mr. Kennedy. My name is Simone Llanos. I'm a junior studying political science and environmental studies at St. Mary's College of Maryland. I'm a junior. My question for you is, how do you feel about the Paris Accord? What are your thoughts on it? And do you think it's the right step for the U.S. to take in the mitigation against climate change?
Again, I think the Paris Accord is important. It's crazy and dismaying for Trump to walk away from it. But it's it's an important first step, but every journey begins with the first step. And it's a step where the world got together and said, yeah, this is a crisis, and here's what we're going to do about it. I actually think that if we do the kind of things that I've been talking about, which is to rationalize the the marketplace that the private industry will move far, far faster than the Paris Accord contemplates. I mean, let me just say this. It cost $1 billion to $1.2 billion to build a solar plant. It costs, and it's even now cheaper in Chile and Mexico. They're building them even much cheaper. It costs from $3 to $5 billion to build a coal plant. It cost about $4 billion to build a dual cycle gas plant. It cost about $9 billion to build, and this is a 1 gigawatt I'm talking about throughout, $9 billion to build a nuclear power plant. So, and then, you have to dispose of the waste for 30,000 years, which is 5 times the length of recorded human history. So it's just not economic. And we could make energy by burning prime rib if we wanted. But why wouldn't we take the cheapest way out? And the cheapest way out is right now, there's nobody in the world who will build a coal plant, a gas plant, or oil, or certainly a nuke plant without huge government subsidies. No private industry is going to spend all their own money because the cheapest thing for them to do is, and the guy who's the head of NRG said to me, if he had to build a new plant, if he had $5 billion to build new power plants in any part of the United States, that he would build 5 solar plants. And he owns coal plants, he owns gas plants, he owns oil and nuke. So he's agnostic. He doesn't care what he builds, but he said, it's just the price. The price of solar is so much cheaper than anything else that there's no economic justification. The only reason people are still building those is inertia, is because of it's inertia. It's not, if you were starting from scratch, nobody would build one of those today. And so the question is, how do we just end the subsidies and get people to look at this from scratch?
Thank you very much. That was an excellent question, excellent response, Mr. Kennedy. Sanjiv, would you like to go next?
Hi, my name is Sanjiv Jagtap. I have a master's degree from the University of Florida in agricultural engineering. A lot of my colleagues worked in carbon sequestration, biomass, biofuels, and that sort of thing. In fact, my senior design project as an undergrad was about a biofuel plant. And I think at UF we also have an imagery conference, and we generally explore other ways of quantifying carbon impact and stuff like that. There was a movie recently called Planet of the Humans. It did talk about different accounting ways, different ways of accounting for carbon, but it might have been a bit unfair to you and your colleagues. I'm inviting you to speak on biomass, biofuels, and the film.
My opinion of biomass? Are you asking me my opinion of biomass?
Yes, and relative to how it was portrayed in that film.
Yeah, I didn't see the film, but somebody showed me a clip of the part where I was featured, and I think other people came out kind of worse than me. It was an odd.
Oh, definitely. That's definitely the truth.
But I don't think he was being fair to anybody, because I don't think they understood the context. It happened to be that on the day that I got they interviewed me at a rally, at a climate change rally in New York, and I had just come from across the country looking at in Denver, outside of Denver, there was a testing range that was testing a new kind of biomass, of algae biomass, that could be used to to sequester carbon from cement kilns and coal burning power plants. And it was actually a very impressive system. And so when the guy asked me about biomass, I was like, I said I think what I said to him that it depends on, what the source of the biomass is or whatever. And I think that that's true.
Right. And that's what we've seen in the analysis is something can make sense at one scale and one method of implementation, but then monocultures and industrialization gets a hold of it, like with wood chips. Waste wood is great, but if you start growing all your trees to just burn them, then that's not the same thing.
And I think what they were making, they were applying a single definition of biomass, which was the industrial production of wood pellets, which of course is an abortion. It's like, and none of us were told that. We were, there's a lot of biomass that may or may not work. There's a lot of people who are doing kind of interesting things with hemp and, on small scale. But so I don't know, and by the way, that is not the first movie that has attacked me. And so I don't pay that much attention to it. I was surprised that Michael Moore, went after so many people in our movement who have spent their lives trying to fight, big corporations and big industry to try to discredit them. And I didn't think that was fair, but, people have their own reason for doing stuff.
So, Rock, do we have some other students who might like to ask
Fair
a
enough.
question?
I believe Dylan has a question next.
And
Hi,
where's
Mr. Kennedy. My name is Mchail. I'm a junior at Florida Gulf Coast University studying communications. My question is about congressional politics. HR 763 is a bill that would implement a national carbon fee and dividend program. It has 80 co-sponsors.
What?
All right. It was. My question is about congressional politics.
He was referring to HR 763, the Citizen Climate Lobby carbon fee and dividend program.
Only one of these co-sponsors is a Republican. His name is Francis Rooney, and he's from my district. His position on this and other issues caused him to not run for re-election. What do you think about the carbon fee and dividend programs and its political chances for passage?
I have no idea. I'm sorry, I don't have any idea. I don't know the bill. And
the carbon fee and dividend program is designed to have a carbon tax, but then refund it to the consumers on a per person basis.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense that it might be something that it's a way of getting rid of some of the Republican objections to it, but I have no idea how many sponsors and co-sponsors it has. And the idea that it only has a single Republican co-sponsor in the House, to me, it's going to completely depend on what the what the election does to the United States Senate. Because if you can only get one Republican in the House, you're not going to get past the Republican Senate.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. How about we go to Andrea after this, or next?
My name is Andrea Gomez. I'm currently a junior at Florida Gulf Coast University, majoring in forensic studies. So the administration has stacked our federal agencies with climate deniers and anti-science jungle capitalists. So how can a new administration not only fix this at the top levels of the agencies, but also create opportunities for young professionals who want to help turn government around on this and so many other important issues?
Well, that is a good question. And, it's been, one of the kind of the mantras of the Republican climate denialists for the past 2 decades has been that policy is personnel. And even if you can't change the law, you can make sure it's never enforced by putting people into the agencies who are hostile to the law. And that's what they've done. It's been a strategy that's worked really well for them. And the question is, how much political capital does a new president, or are you talking about the Florida state agency or about the federal agency?
I think we here in Florida, we experience it just as it's experienced at the federal level. We experienced it first.
Yeah,
and we would appeal to the federal government, but now we can't even go there.
Yeah. So I think the federal government, EPA, is now an arm of the carbon industry. And, Florida has got a Republican governor who is hostile to climate regulation. And I think there's not going to be much of a change in that. And what happens, I think, is that you have to, anything good that gets done is going to be more and more localized. It's going to happen in, the city of Miami, and it's going to happen in, municipalities. And I know, like, the smartest people that I know of who are your age, who are looking for jobs, are not looking for jobs at EPA. And they're not even looking at jobs in the state agencies. They're going to the city of Atlanta, and they're going to, the municipalities that tend to be more liberal and more innovative and more committed to, and also are seeing the problems firsthand about trying to fortify their cities against climate change. So I'm sorry to depress you further, but that's what I'm seeing. So I don't really have any better advice for you than that.
One question, Rock, do you have any other students on deck to ask a question?
No, not at the moment.
What about, we're talking about domestic economic incentives and regulatory structures. But, because we missed the opportunity in the 80s to develop our own alternative energy and share those technologies, innovative technologies for energy production and for agricultural production with nations like China, we missed their ramp up period. Now they have infrastructure in place that they want to depreciate over 30 years, all these coal plants. So we've got this whole developing world that is on a different trajectory right now. And how do we structure, Trump has been working on tariff policies that address our consumer objectives. Whereas it seems to me like it would be best served if our tariff structures serve this overall environmental and climate objective. What do you see as the global dynamic as to people elevating themselves, having access to what is not ideal technology, and how do we get beyond that at the international level?
Well, I'll tell you what, John, my experience with China and even India is very different than yours. I go over there and see really strong commitments to, to solar. I think they're installing more solar every year than we have in our entire country, total. And they have, I've been to their factories. They're just, they're really committed to it. And they are still using coal. They don't like it. It has direct impact, economic impacts. It's making their people sick. They have a lot of days in Beijing particularly. But in Guangdong and some of the other provinces where they have to close down the cities, nobody likes the coal. Everybody's trying to get away from it. And their commitment to solar, to electric cars, is much, much higher than ours is. Oh, I think what we need to do is pay attention to our own stuff. And then, and as you say, develop the infrastructure we can then sell to other countries so that we actually can profit from it. The way that we did with automobiles, we built the first highway system. And for 30 years after that, everybody in the world wanted to buy a Cadillac or a Ford, I mean, when I was growing up, I never saw a foreign car in this country, and everybody in Europe who could afford one had an American car. Certainly in Latin America, you can go to Cuba today and you can see what the world looked like in 1950s, which is every car was an American car because we built infrastructure. And if we build the infrastructure for green energy in this country, we're going to be supplying green energy to the world. And, we do have a technological edge on people. China's done an amazing job. And, China put we had a lot of investments. My group had a lot of investments in solar panel, PV panel manufacturers in this country, and all of them went out of business because the Chinese were just dumping solar panels. I think the Chinese were creating something like, maybe 3 or 4 gigawatts of solar panels every year, and the whole world demand was 2 gigawatts. And so they put out of business all of our people, but the good part of it is that, solar became very, very accessible to everybody in our country, and they created another industry here of people who install solar panels.
One of the things I've observed, in looking at some of the carbon analysis is solar is great, but it's not really that green until the solar panels are being fabricated using energy from solar panels. So the first generation that are dependent upon these coal plants are a step in the right direction, but they don't really get us to where we need to be. So we have to hope that China retires their coal plants before their useful life is up. Whereas in this country, they try to hold on to those assets until they're fully depreciated. And we got to hope that they do a better job than we have.
Yeah.
So Rock,
that's true across the board. I mean, Toyota's making really good hydrogen cars right now, but the hydrogen's all made from burning carbon. So, but you got it. The chicken and the egg.
Right.
Somebody's got to start.
Right. So Rock, do we have other questions?
Yes, actually, I do have another question from Erin.
Hi, my name is Erin. I am majoring in psychology at FGCU. So my question is, what is the problem, do you think, in getting people to take action on climate change? Because it seems that there is the large aspect of people just not choosing to believe that it is real and therefore not wanting to do anything about it because they don't think it's a problem. So how do you think we could change this?
I mean, to me, if you go around the world, what you see in the United States is really anomalous. People in the rest of the world recognize that it's a cataclysmic problem. The thing is, in the United States, is that the oil industry and the coal industry have spent hundreds of millions of dollars, persuading people that climate change is a hoax, that it's a deep state conspiracy, that, all the stuff you hear about it. And, the problem with advertising is that advertising works. And that's why you have whole industries that are based on advertising. If you tell people a lie or a big lie or a little lie enough times, a certain number of people will abandon critical thinking and believe it. And so, what can you do about that? Can you tell the oil industry they need to stop doing that? That's a possibility. At one point, the tobacco industry, that's kind of an analogous situation. The tobacco industry was doing the same thing for many years, and the the Attorney General in New York, they actually had one of these phony front groups, where they had their own phony scientists. We call them biostitutes. And they had, a PR system, and it was called the Tobacco Institute. But the oil industry has 100 of those. But the Tobacco Institute, ultimately, the Attorney General, Republican Attorney General Dennis Vacco, abolished them and then distributed their assets and gave them the corporate death penalty. And we've already backing away a lot of the industry has agreed not to support that kind of propaganda anymore, but the propaganda kind of has a life of its own. It's become part of the right-wing ideology. I do a lot of work on vaccines, and the people who tend to follow me on that issue, a lot of them are Republicans, and many of them are Trump supporters. And it's really interesting for me to listen, to watch what they say about this, because many of them absolutely believe that the pharmaceutical industries are lying, but the oil industries are telling the truth. And and they haven't thought it through. It's just part of the ideology of the right now, is that, and a lot of it is because Trump has said it's a hoax, and they believe Trump. And they don't see that, the deep state is the oil industry and the CIA. And I've been fighting the deep state my entire life, and I know who it is. It's the oil industry, it's the CIA, it's the intelligence apparatus, and it's, the military industrial complex. And part of the oil industry strategy has just been to lie to the American public about the cause of, one of the major causes of doing business. And so how do you get rid of that? Well, the answer to your question is there may be a possibility to sue some of the people who have been promoting this. Now, Exxon, the Attorney General we had a really great Attorney General in New York until recently. He got involved in a sex scandal and had to leave. But he was going to sue Exxon. And I think, part of his problem and part of the reason that the scandal blew up the way it was is that the oil industry was really worried about him. But he got documents which we helped get for him, going back to the 70s, in which Exxon's own scientists were saying, we are going to melt the globe. And by the way, it's going to be a good thing, because we're going to be able to get more oil out of the Arctic, because there's not going to be any ice there anymore. But everybody else is going to be miserable. And, then we had 20, 30 years of emails between them and communications saying, we're going to wreck the globe, but let's go ahead and do it anyway, and don't talk about it. And he was getting ready to sue them when he got, when he was forced out of office. So I think if we can get an Attorney General, a good state's Attorney General, who's willing to pick up that lawsuit, there may be a way to fight them on that.
And the importance of an aggressive and progressive Attorney General.
Yeah.
So I think we had a question from Aidan. Let's see if we can get Aidan to unmute. There you are, Aidan.
Hello, my name is Aidan, and I'm a member of Fridays for Future, but I live in Canada, but I just joined this because I really follow you, Robert Kennedy, and I really am impressed with what you're doing. But I'm concerned often that reducing our consumption is often left out of a discussion. And I noticed that a lot of young people are concerned about our economic system and the profit motive, which is creating an incentive for more production. And not just renewable energy is going to save us, also reducing our consumption. So, and the free market seems to create an incentive for more all the time. So I wondered, how can we conserve energy and create an economic system that's based on a need-based society?
Well, I would not agree with you on that. When I don't think the point should be to reduce consumption or to implement deprivation. The point should be to reduce impact, environmental impact. And that I don't believe necessarily means that you have to destroy your quality of life. Because I also believe in the human capacity for innovation and the resourcefulness. And so what I would say is punish bad consumption, reward good consumption. And that have an economic system that does that. Very easy to design that. Punish the use of raw materials, cutting down trees, reward the use of recycled materials, of extracting materials from landfills and from trash bins and recycling. And I would not say that the way that politically or any other way, you'll never change human behavior through moral suasion. You can change human behavior by realigning economic incentives. It's the only way you can do it. You can't do it by saying that there's only a certain number of people in a society who will pay more for something because bored with the head of Procter & Gamble. And he had 100 years of consumer data. And he showed them to me, and he said that the most that they can ever get from telling somebody you can save whales or you can do this by paying 25% more for this product, he said that only 8% of people will do that. Tops, the best appeal throughout hundreds of years of consumer. People will pay more if they think it's good for their own health. And so what you have to do is you have to devise an economic system that says, listen, like they have in Europe, they don't have landfills in Europe. Why don't they have landfills in Europe? Because if you're the producer of a package, when you send that package into the stream of commerce, it's weighed, measured, and you're charged for it if you don't recover it. In our country, the taxpayer pays for its disposal, so there's no cost of putting huge shit into the market. And that's why the Fresh Kills landfill is the highest point on the east coast of North America. Like you don't get in Europe, you won't get like your credit card coming from Amazon in a shoebox full of peanuts like we do here, because Amazon would have to pay a cost of getting rid of all that stuff. So you say to Amazon, anything you put in the stream of commerce, you got to pay to get rid of, and Amazon is now going to hand deliver your credit card with no packaging on it. They're going to do it in a tiny little envelope that is biodegradable. And so the way that you change people's behavior is you realign the economic incentives so that people can do well by doing good. You can make money by doing good things for other people and by bringing abundance to other people. And don't tell people that environmentalism means you have to suffer, because it doesn't. It means you have to be smart. And that's I think, a much more attractive way of doing it. Oh, anyway.
Well, I think that's sort of a hopeful and excellent way to sort of summarize our conversation and what people should take away from this and as far as moving forward in their lives and through their careers and practices. So Rock, maybe you can close us out. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy.
Definitely want to thank you, Mr. Kennedy, for coming today, especially from all of us at Campus Climate Corps, all of us in the under 25, under 30, under 35. In fact, I'd say under any kind of age. We definitely want to thank you for all the activism that you've done. As I said, I'm only a couple of chapters into your book, but it's already quite fantastic and amazing to read through that material. And I invite, of course, all the students and other participants who are here today to follow us, especially on our social media pages as we work with the United Nations and other international groups to bring America and American students into the international fold and help fight climate change with the more technical and academic backgrounds, as well as the more social aspects of that as well. And again, thank you all for coming today, especially again, Mr. Kennedy, and hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much. John, good to see you, man.
Bye.